Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Starr, Chief Marketing Officer of D-Fend Solutions. Welcome to our webinar series. We have a brand new webinar series that we're very excited about, focused on airports. The name of the series itself is Control for Clear Skies, Counter-Drone Concepts for Airports. And there'll be a number of different sessions within this webinar series. And our first one kind of takes a big step back, origins, preparations, and actions. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce the Chairman and CEO of D-Fend Solutions, Zohar Halachmi, who's going to give you a little bit of background about D-Fend Solutions, talk to you about our commitment to the airport sector, and introduce our distinguished panel. So, Zohar, if you want to take it from here.
Thank you very much. Hello, all. Again, thank you for joining. I hope that you will enjoy the session. Very quick type of introduction about us. As Jeffrey mentioned, we are the leading counter-drone solution provider in the world with this unique cyber takeover capability. Quickly about us, founded in 2017, we currently have over 100 different types of customers, airports, military, national security deployments, over 15 countries. And out of these 15, 4 are Five Eyes type of countries, and 5 of the G7, of the 7 G7 countries using our product as well. We are being deployed over 5 continents. And what's really relevant for this session today, in one of these G7 countries, we are protecting 88% of all the international passengers arriving in and out of that country. And again, this is a G7 country. Right now, we have a little bit over 150 employees based in Israel, and we have offices spread in DC, in Canada, UK, Germany, Spain, Netherlands, and Japan. So that's really quickly about ourselves. We consider airports and airspace vertical to be one of our major ones, and we started all of our activity focusing on this, what we consider to be sensitive environments type of world, and we heavily invest in this vertical. We try to observe all the different changes, requirements, regulations, and this is exactly what we are trying to do over here as well, is actually to share our information, share what we already know, and what we gathered from other type of deployments we have with you. In order to do that, both Michael and Mark agreed to help us and to share their experience in this vertical as well. So Michael Huerta, quick type of introduction, former FAA administrator between 2011 to 2018. During that time, he was managing a budget of over $16 billion with something like 47,000 employees. Part of that, he was also served as an acting Secretary of Transportation of the US. He sits in several boards, and Delta Airlines is one of the examples. And he's on our advisory board as well. So this is Michael. Mark, who is joining us as well, is a partner in Fox Rothschild LLP, very much experienced with over 3 decades of experience in the aviation and transportation law, including litigation, regulations, administrative matters, and all of that. He represents many type of mass disasters, multi-district litigations, Federal Aviation regulatory and enforcement type of organizations worldwide and in the US. I believe that both of them will be able to share a lot of information and share the knowledge with us. And I really would like to thank you, both Michael and Mark, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zohar. And what I'm going to do quite quickly, actually, is present a little bit background and context just to set the stage for the more intensive discussion on some of the issues that we want to cover in the first webinar. And we're going to just start off by bringing up the obvious context, which is incidents. And there's just been this massive increase. We call it the incessant increase, the nonstop increase in incidences, even with slowdowns caused by the pandemic and other factors. The fact is, it's just relentless. It's happening nonstop. Now, everybody knows about the infamous Gatwick airport incident at the end of 2018. And while that one was a major gating factor, a major catalyst for action, a real turning point in terms of the focus and investment and attention on this issue, it wasn't the only one. There have been many other incidences since then. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just we gave you a timeline here just to show a representative example. And a lot of these are major airports. I mean, soon after the Gatwick airport, there were incidents at Heathrow, incidents at Newark. These affected not one or two, but tens of flights. There were flight diversions at Dublin. Dubai actually shut down for half an hour because of an incident. Frankfurt, 70 flights canceled. And then there were more incidents at Frankfurt a few months later. Major delays in Madrid. Riga completely shut down for a period of time. And it's not abating. It continues. There was a famous event, not just airport specific, but even not just regular commercial scheduled flights, but Air Force One, where the president's plane had a near miss with a drone. And again, more incidents at Frankfurt Airport. And then, the list goes on and on. Just last summer, an issue at Boston Logan. And these are all public domain. These are all available. So you can see here that it's nonstop. It just continues to be a major issue. Incidents itself at the major airports. And as I mentioned, it's not just commercial flights. When an airport is hosting some sort of VIP or leader kind of flights, then there's a whole set of different issues around drone incidents. And so these are just some of the headlines that occurred when there was the one incident with Air Force One. Now, just briefly, the threat itself, I mean, most of the audience here is airport professionals. But it does, I think, be helpful to just look at the basics in terms of why airports in particular and the unique vulnerabilities. I mean, when airplanes are flying at low altitude, in relation to the drone's altitude, there's a real vulnerability here, especially during this period of minimal maneuver capabilities of takeoff and landing, especially when there are known predictable flight paths that actors can know. And that there's quite a relevant distance beyond the immediate area that has to be taken into account. And there have been a lot of studies. One of the more impressive ones, in-depth ones, was just conducted last year by the CNRC, the Canada National Research Council. And it's a very comprehensive study. It's available in the public domain. I encourage you to look at it. Their kind of bottom line quote that we saw from their study is the risk of impacting an aircraft at low altitude remains high from both the malicious and the careless. And so there have been a number of other studies. And the one issue that keeps coming up a lot is the notion of operational disruption, the business continuity issue, the consequences. When an incident occurs, lots of things have to then be set into motion to deal with this incident. And you can see it can take on quite heavy proportions. Just looking at Germany alone, where there were 92 incidents in 2020, many periods where air traffic had to be severely restricted. Frankfurt Airport was out of service for a couple of hours following two incidents, again, just as a kind of representative case study. And this can happen and is happening at many airports. The specific threat can range. You can talk about collisions, attacks, surveillance or espionage, but that again just points to the complexity of the drone incident issue at airport and how countermeasures really need to take into account all these different aspects. One of the challenges, and we'll also get into this in some of the later webinars in this series where we focus more on the technologies and the solutions, but the traditional counter UAS products, technology solutions came from the conventional military sector, and they weren't necessarily designed for civilian airports. And we can just quickly review that. I mean, when you look at it only from the detection side, and technologies very, tried and true, really technologies that have achieved a lot in recent years and for quite a long time, things like radar, optical, acoustic, directional finders, but they all have certain constraints or certain drawbacks in the civilian environment. We know that radars can generate or detect false positives, in other words, other objects that are not drones, such as birds. We know that optical requires a clear line of sight, and when you have urban environments or airports that are in more urban environments, that's an impediment. Directional finders may not be able to detect the actual GPS location of the drone, and acoustic, as drones get quieter and environments get noisier, those methods also fall short when it comes to detection. And these differences and drawbacks are even more stark when you look at the mitigation side of things. And mitigation has basically been two things in a general way: jamming or kinetic, something physical, shooting something, or a projectile. And they're obviously not suitable for the airport environment for the reasons that you're familiar with. Jamming is only temporary, and it causes disruption to the other communications and signals in the area, especially a communications intensive environment like an airport. And kinetic, anything physical, it's the projectile itself, or even if the projectile misses, there's a high risk of collateral damage. And even if the drone is hit by the projectile, you have the falling drone itself. So there's enormous issues of collateral damage, making what you can do in detection and mitigation in an airport environment a whole different, really paradigm shift required. The other thing, and this is kind of the good news, is that drones are doing a great job at airports. Drones are proliferating at airport. I'm talking now about authorized drones, friendly drones, beneficial drones. They're literally changing the way airports operate. You have lots of authorized drones playing an increasingly critical role at airports. They're performing surveillance. They're performing inspection. They're looking at the condition of runways. They're helping with all kinds of applications, all kinds of use cases. But this just makes the issue of the rogue drones even more difficult, because you have to distinguish now between the authorized, friendly, acceptable, permitted drones versus the unauthorized, hostile or rogue drones. And obviously now with the new drone economy, critical drone performed tasks just cannot be shut down routinely. They're part of the fabric and fiber now of many airport operations, and that has to be taken into account. So these are just some of the complex issues around which this discussion is playing out. Now, in terms of our new airport webinar series, we wanted to start at the foundation. We wanted to talk about the backdrop, the history, the policy, the regulations, the legislation, and a little bit of, in that context, what airports and airport professionals can start to do as far as preparation and action. And then we're going to evolve this webinar series to build off of that foundation and talk about more specifically drone threats, different types of drone threats, how to contend with them, and then ultimately technologies, solutions, and products and countermeasures. So this is kind of the methodology by which we're unfolding this this dialogue, this discussion, if you will. And with that, I want to move over to the main portion of this talk, which is the topics, the panel discussion topics. We've received many of these topics from you as input into the webinar series prior to its starting. So a lot of this is coming from the audience or from our own travels and discussions with a number of you in the airport industry. And we're really interested in hearing Michael and Mark's perspective on a range of these issues. And I'll jump right into them. So the first is how we got here. a little bit of history, looking at the technology and the evolution of the regulations in terms of how they match that technology. Related to that, we'll then talk about kind of some jurisdictions as well. But first, let's just talk about, the technology and how the regulations have evolved or not evolved with that technology. And so let me start with Michael, and just if you could give a little bit of your observations as far as how that's unfolded in recent years, Michael.
Jeffrey, well, thank you very much. And it's really good to be here and to talk about the evolution of unmanned aircraft and how they're contributing to the larger aviation ecosystem. You're absolutely right. This is a very rapidly evolving area, and one that is really founded in the technology sector as opposed to the traditional aviation sector. And so it brings with it a number of characteristics that are really affecting how it is being rolled out. You made the point that a lot of this is beneficial technology. You can conduct surveys of aircraft, surveys of airport infrastructure with drones. You're able to gain a unique perspective. But the challenge is that many of the people who are flying recreational drones or are in the drone industry are relatively new to aviation and really don't have a good understanding of the protocols and practices and everything that's needed to ensure a safe and secure system. Just to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, though, in the United States for a number of years, we've had a requirement that drones be registered by the FAA. And I'll just give you a couple of numbers to frame how significant this is. We have on the aircraft registry of the United States something like 300,000 aircraft, and of those, only about 7,500 are commercial aircraft. Now, it's taken us about 100 years to get there in terms of those numbers. But in the drone registry, which has only been around for 5-6 years, we have, 1.5 million.
Wow.
Significant numbers of drones that have been registered. And that just indicates how this is fundamentally changing aviation in many ways. The other thing that I think it's important to point out is that these are very small and very agile aircraft, but it means that they're also difficult to see. And so the FAA and our partners at the federal government level have really focused on what are the technologies that we need to deploy in order to identify these aircraft if you can't see them. Traditional aircraft will be broadcasting their position and a few characteristics of the aircraft. And recently, the FAA did put out a final rule called remote identification, which provided an initial step in terms of being able to identify these smaller drones and other small aircraft that might be operating in the same airspace as more traditional aviation. I guess the final point I'd want to talk about is, as it relates to how this has evolved, is we in the US have very complex airspace. It may look like a big wide open sky, but there is an awful lot going on there. We have the most well-developed general aviation industry in the entire world. We have a very significant commercial aviation sector. And now we have these new entrants, drones and other users that are increasingly wanting a piece of being able to fly and take advantage of all the benefits associated with that. And how we integrate that is a big challenge for the industry and for regulators. And so this is an industry that's developing very quickly. It has grown to, just to tremendous levels in a relatively short period of time. And as often happens, the regulatory environment has not been able to keep up with the technology environment, despite the best efforts of everyone in government and in industry to ensure that this is done safely and securely. So that's why technologies that enable us to see what's going on in the system and to respond to it become very, very important.
Right, great perspective, especially the ratio of the proliferation in the skies relative to the traditional aircraft, and obviously all the implications there. Mike, what's your sense of how the regulations have adapted or not adapted or kept up with the rapidly changing traffic in the skies and technological developments?
Well, I think it's one of those things. Regulations, obviously, the regulatory environment we operate in today is completely different from what it was, 4 or 5 years ago. It was kind of the Wild West before 2014, 2015. And in fact, before, the 333 exemptions, there really wasn't even a legal way to operate commercially an unmanned aircraft. So when you think about it in that context, the regulations have developed in a fairly comprehensive way fairly quickly. But I think as Michael pointed out, particularly since the drones are driven by the tech industry, the regulations can never keep up with the rate of the development of the technology. And it's funny because I've gone into meetings, with some of these companies with the FAA where they have something unique or there's a new problem or something that they need to discuss. They feel they need to discuss with the FAA about what the problem is and get some guidance from the FAA about what the solution is. And it's funny because in every one of those meetings, the people at the FAA will start out correctly by pointing out, it's like, we're not innovators, we're regulators. You people who are the innovators, you need to identify what the problems are for us in a way that we maybe don't understand. And then because you're more intimately familiar with the technology and the problems, you need to propose a solution. And then once you propose a solution or you give us some idea of what the solutions are, then we can do our job, which is saying, well, how is your proposed solution going to mesh with the regulatory framework that affects everybody else, manned aviation, other unmanned aviation, communications, the whole host of, systems that go into operating the national airspace system. And so in that regard, it's unfortunate, but we're always going to be in a situation where the regulations and the legal solutions are going to be behind what the development of the problem and the technology is.
Makes sense. And that your last point there about the complexity of it, and I know that when we've made site visits to airports and walked around with all the either the regulators or the operators on the ground at any given airport, and also this is just the norm, the amount of let's say shared jurisdiction or shared responsibilities or interfacing responsibilities in terms of the different elements of the airspace or the different functional occurrences happening in the sky and on the ground and the multiple bodies involved. And I know, Michael, you were on the federal level, but you also worked closely with earlier in your career at the state and local level, and you always interfacing there. How does this complex regulatory environment in the airspace and at airports at the local, federal, and state level, how is that shared and multi-pronged kind of regulatory environment, all the different levels, how is that show itself in this new emerging drones at airports issue? How is that going to play out in terms of what are the roles and responsibilities of the regulators at the different levels of government?
Yeah, well, we have here in the US a federated model for the management of airports. By and large, they are state and local government entities. They may be special districts. And then you have to overlay on that. You have at the federal level through the FAA, the exclusive authority to regulate everything once it leaves the ground. Now, all that comes together at the airport. And what has resulted from that is a shared responsibility. For example, the FAA will issue regulations and standards on how the airport would operate. It provides federal grants that ensure that the public infrastructure can be maintained in a consistent way across airport infrastructure. But the federal government recognizes the authority of state and local governments. The airport operates to locate an airport wherever they choose to locate it, and they have the operational responsibility for that airport. Part of that operational responsibility is ensuring the security and the safety of that particular facility. And so, for example, the FAA through the grant program might offer financial assistance to an airport to secure the airport, something as simple as a fence. But it is ultimately the airport authority itself that is responsible for having the security personnel on site to ensure that no one is breaching that fence. And so that indicates how all of this has to work together when you're dealing with a new threat that might be evolving. You have to respect the different roles that the FAA might have to operate the airspace and flights in and out of the airport, while at the same time recognizing the responsibility that the airport itself has in many aspects of securing that facility.
Right. Michael, you want to add to that in terms of your observations of how these have often played out in some of the cases or incidents that you've seen in terms of federal, state, local?
Yeah, when we're talking about the keeping everybody safe, it's everybody, as Michael points out, assumes that the FAA is on the leading edge of any of these incidents, and they're really not, because it's a combination of things. It's a resources issue. FAA doesn't have, there's the FAA police don't go out and track down people who are flying drones illegally and then take them into custody. They make it clear that work has to be done either by people who are working for security at the airport, or in most of these cases, the person who is flying the drone that's interfering with the airport, they could be far beyond the fence where they're actually operating. And so that's going to be the job of state and local law enforcement, to actually do the physical work of tracking the person down and identifying the person, and then taking them into custody, or gathering evidence to enable future prosecution. And in fact, the FAA several times has come out with some very good guidance to state and local governments, telling them exactly, giving them a framework of what an illegal drone operation would look like. If you encounter one of these, what's the type of evidence we need you to collect for us, so that we can then go ahead and do our civil enforcement or even criminal enforcement from the Justice Department. But even with that, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that the federal police power is relatively limited. It's limited to certain enumerated federal crimes and federal areas, and that in this country, plenary police power, the real public safety police power, is always at the state and local level. And even when we're talking about aviation, the state and local government has a very deep toolbox it can use for things like a good example is reckless endangerment. Reckless endangerment is a very serious crime. It's basically if you act in a way where you show a complete disregard for the life and safety of other people, and you in fact endanger their lives. And there was an incident, this was a while ago, but somebody had flown a drone at, I believe it was the US Open tennis match. And there was a federal enforcement that went along with it, but at the local level, they went after the person who flew it for reckless endangerment, which again is a serious crime with serious jail time. So that's why having state and local governments both knowledgeable about what they can and can't do in terms of enforcement, but having them engaged in a process where they know how to get the facts and to do the things that are going to be necessary to ultimately punish and deter people from doing these wrongful acts.
Right.
Jeffrey, if I could add something
Sure.
to that as well. I think that one of the things, because this is still relatively new, there is, this really puts a premium on the partnership that exists between the federal, state, and local levels. I think that, it is well understood that the federal government has very broad authorities for ensuring the safety of the aviation system. And that's different from other modes of transportation, say highways and transit systems, many of which are operated at the state and local level. And so our state and local partners, as they are looking at this threat coming through the aviation system, they're learning what authorities they actually have, or how to work in partnership with the federal agencies. And what this really puts a premium on is, because this is evolving so quickly, communication is key. There have to be relationships that are developed so that everyone understands what their respective equities are. And at the same time, they know who the people are that they can contact for advice on how to deal with this newly evolving threat landscape. And the FAA has actually done a really good job of putting out, as Mark said, guidance and best practices. And they've really opened up a level of communication to help the state and local partners understand what the federal government is thinking about, but also giving them guidelines on how they might address that.
Right, right. Yeah, this whole shared responsibility model is evolving in a very fascinating way as it relates to drone incidents. Now, the obvious functional issue, or when the trying to get really practical, the next thing to think about is actual mitigation, of course. And there's a whole range of issues, certainly around mitigation. And I know, Michael, that you played a major role participating in a chairing, I believe, a blue ribbon task force that was initiated by the industry, by two industry groups, in which the FAA was also a major participant. And they had some interesting findings and recommendations going forward. So maybe could you elaborate a little bit on the work that you did there and the work and what came out of it?
The Blue Ribbon Task Force was actually a really interesting activity where we brought together a lot of people in the unmanned aircraft industry, the airport industry, law enforcement, and the federal government to really take a focused look at this issue. The precipitating event was the Gatwick incident of 2018. But it really prompted AUVSI, which is the major trade association for the unmanned aircraft industry, and ACI North America, which is Airports Council International, which is one of the most significant trade associations for the large commercial airports in the US and Canada. And they wanted to come together to really try to understand the scope of the problem and what are some specific things that they might recommend both for leadership in governments in the US and Canada, but also among their members in terms of best practices. It was really good in terms of laying out the scope of the challenges that are out there. And we identified a number of things working with the task force. My co-chair was the CEO of Los Angeles International Airport at the time. She's now leading a major airport in Canada, Deborah Flint. But it was a nice mix of perspectives. And one of the things that we really very early on focused on was this shared responsibility that we've been talking about, but also what does that mean in terms of roles that we need to play in doing this? There were some things that were clearly identified as being a federal responsibility. At that time, the FAA had not yet issued rules on identification of drones, the remote ID rule that I talked about a little bit before. We, of course, recommended that work be expedited and that be put out in the public domain, because when you're trying to identify drones operating in the airspace, you need to know who is authorized to be there. And this remote ID rule was foundational for doing that. And so I really congratulate the agency on completing the work on that. We also identified a question of authorities, that what authorities do state and local law enforcement have and what authorities are needed. As you heard from Mark, the federal government's enforcement authority, while it's very expansive, doesn't address every conceivable situation. And as it was put by the mayor of a major city, he described the problem this way, that if there are drone incidents happening within his city, his constituents are not going to call the FAA. They're probably not even going to know to call the FAA. And as Mark pointed out, it's not like the FAA has a whole police force that can respond to these incidents. His point was his constituents are going to call the mayor. And what he needs to understand is what are the authorities that that his police force might have. And we did identify that there are gaps that need to be addressed. And we called on leadership in both countries in our respective legislatures to ensure that the comprehensive problem is really well understood, and that at all levels of government, they have the appropriate authorities to take whatever actions are necessary to mitigate this threat. So those are a couple of the things that we focused on. We also noted that this is an industry that is going to continue to grow and to evolve, and that it will be necessary to monitor the development and evolution of this to ensure that governmental authorities can respond appropriately.
Makes sense. And now, so that was that task force. You know, it had really got the ball rolling in terms of some of these initiatives around recommendations and analyzing the threat and ultimately, you know, steps toward mitigation. Now, Mark, when you look at the traditional technologies and when you look at drone incursions and you look at the, you know, how people have traditionally mitigated UASs in the sky from let's say the military environment. I talked earlier about the obvious shortcomings of such technologies from a functional, technological, and risk and safety and control perspective. But what about from a legal perspective? Things like jamming and kinetic and physical and other technologies. What you know, what are some of the regulatory legal issues around them? Or you know, even if they're even relevant, can they even be used at all? You know.
Yeah, well, it's important to keep in mind before we start talking about this is that you know, while aviation is primarily the responsibility of the FAA, and you know, it's almost a one-stop shop for the most part with most operational issues. When you're talking about counter drone, even at the federal level, there's a patchwork of agencies that are involved, and they all have their finger in the pie.
Right.
You know, the FAA obviously is responsible for, you know, the safety of the aircraft and the airports and the regulations that govern all of that. But the DHS obviously is involved in certain, not just areas of aviation security, but just in the homeland security and being primarily responsible for federal response to terrorism attacks, which obviously some of these drone attacks notionally could be. And then also, you know, a major player in this is the FCC, which keeps very tight control over all communications and broadcasting policy in the United States. You know, and unlike, you know, some of these other areas where, you know, we have a system where the state can regulate certain things and the federal government kind of has a dual responsibility, and they can both regulate some things at the same time. FCC is one of those areas where all regulation is done at the federal level, and they've, you know, it's perfectly clear. When we're talking about, for example, about jamming and other kind of electromagnetic emissions, the FCC prohibits everyone from operating a jammer except for certain military organizations and under certain very narrowly constrained circumstances. And so, like, you know, people assume that if the situation arose, that, you know, maybe the state or local law enforcement could operate some kind of jammer, and the answer to that is no. The state and local law enforcement have never had the authority to operate that kind of equipment. So even when you're talking about you know, a quasi-governmental entity like an airport, you know, an airport authority, they're never really going to qualify to operate any kind of jamming. And that would apply regardless of whether you're talking about jamming, you know, a communications band that you think the drone is operating on to stop the controller from communicating with the drone, but also any solution that's going to be aimed at jamming GPS. And obviously the FCC does that because, you know, the potential outcome of jamming bands that are used, you know, by other entities and for other purposes, you can have, you know, a cascading, widespread results that nobody wants to contemplate. So when you're talking about the jamming, that's just something that probably will never be a solution unless it's something where, and this has happened in limited circumstances. There's been some federal deployment of jamming operations, but it's primarily been the military and under very select circumstances where there's a high national security interest. But it's, for use at an airport, it probably never. And then as we talked about, and from a regulatory standpoint, things, a kinetic solution where you're either going to try and snare or destroy an aircraft. Obviously, there's all sorts of regulatory issues because there's a federal statute that makes it a crime for people to destroy a civil aircraft in flight, which technically a drone, even a hobby drone, is a civil aircraft that is operating in the airspace. So there are legal issues with that. And then just practical regulatory issues because, if you destroy a drone at the airport, there are all these regulations about FOD, foreign object debris, and the contamination of a runway and the potential hazards for that. And so if you're destroying something in a way where you're scattering parts, there are all sorts of regulatory implications for then ensuring that the site where you intercepted the drone isn't going to interfere with operations, even once the drone threat itself has been neutralized. So they said there's a lot of legal and regulatory elements that affect all the whole range of these mitigations.
Right, and Michael, perhaps you can touch on that too, from your ex-regulator perspective on how regulators related to or looked at these kind of technologies, either not only what the situation was from a regulatory perspective, but was there even any outlook for change as it relates to those traditional technologies around airports?
Well, as you talked about earlier, Jeffrey, an airport has a lot of sophisticated technology that's deployed around it to operate the air traffic control system. And that includes radar, it includes surveillance systems, it includes communication systems. And so earlier, years ago, as the threat was first starting to develop, there was some experimentation that a few airports went through where what they wanted to do was to deploy systems to give them a view of, and perhaps an understanding of what the drone threat would look like. And the agency was rightly very concerned that they didn't know what technologies were being deployed, and they wanted to ensure that whatever was being deployed on the airport is not going to interfere with the critical air navigation responsibilities that they have. And so this has been an ongoing conversation, and the agency is also conducting, as is the Department of Homeland Security, they're both conducting a number of demonstration activities to evaluate different technologies to ensure, first and foremost, that they're not going to create unanticipated problems in the airport environment. But secondly, to rate their effectiveness. Are they actually useful and doing a good job in mitigating the threat that might be out there? And so, this is all part of what this is informing is what the regulatory standards ultimately need to be to ensure that all of this stuff can coexist in the airport environment. There are solutions that are out there. They just, but it requires a level of cooperation, and it requires that everyone act with a level of urgency to ensure that these standards can be put in place and that we can mitigate the threat while at the same time ensuring the continued safe operations of the airport environment.
Great. Great. So now let's, building on that, going towards, hold on. Let me get this. Okay, in terms of these technologies and the reach they have, another area, an interesting kind of angle to all this is, communications and privacy and the potential for certain technologies, and how does privacy issues kind of relate to the drone itself and all the data and information that's in a drone and around a drone, and how, I think it's important that the end user operators, the airport personnel, as well as vendors and technology, the whole community that's dealing with counter UAS, really making sure that the reach of these technologies stays focused on the operational mission itself. simply preventing an incident or contending with an incident or dealing with an incident in a way that leads to a safe outcome going forward as these technologies evolve and as this threat increases. So what are some of the potential issues there, and how should the community of both the operators, the airport operators, the regulators, and the technology vendors really kind of focus and make sure that that the technology is really focused on that mission and doesn't encroach into other areas? I mean, when you think of the drone itself and all the information that's potentially in a drone around the pilot, the video, and everything else, the application that the drone is performing, what are some of the concerns and issues that that all of these different players need to take into account? Mark, let's start with you.
Yeah, so the one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about privacy, it's actually kind of the reverse of what we've been talking about in terms of regulation of safety and communications. The FAA has made it perfectly clear that they have no interest in privacy. They're not involved in privacy. So any kind of privacy issue involving unmanned aircraft, they've completely stayed out of it. So that's something that should be regulated primarily at the state and local level. And that's true, in most areas. There really aren't, a lot of broad federal privacy laws. It's almost all at the state and local level. And generally, every law is going to be different depending on where you are, but they're all going to protect the collection and dissemination of, personally identifiable information that you can connect with someone, and then taking that and then publishing it or making it available to other people. Or as we've seen more recently, it's not just the publishing of it on your behalf, but if you have that data and it's unsecured, then there's a data breach, then there's a liability for the fact that you've collected all of this personal identifiable information from people. And then as part of the data breach, it's gotten out and someone has gotten publicity or notoriety for something that they did not give you permission to disseminate about. And then potentially there's legal liability there. And as I said, the state and local privacy laws are very broad. And they're not tailored necessarily to drones, but they're going to obviously apply to people who are operating drones. And then similarly, if you're operating systems, that are using cameras or other technology to gather information about people, on a mass basis, there are always concerns about the storage of that data and the reasons why you collected the data. So under all circumstances, you should have your system designed in a way that you're weeding out at some point, since you're storing data, you're weeding out data that you don't need for the specific purpose that you're doing. So you might want to have some way to identify, has this person and his drone been here on multiple occasions, and you're trying to build up a threat profile, that's one thing. But if it's just, there are people, your system is picking up data who are flying legally in an area where they're allowed to fly, and you're just keeping that data, there are always potentially going to be issues there with, again, either the unauthorized release of the data or, someone finding out that you're collecting this data about them and storing it. And again, that if it violates some reasonable expectation of privacy, then there are potentially, more issues that are going to come out. So you should always, have a data policy in place that governs not just the collection of the data, but certainly the storage of the data. Data should have some kind of expiration date on it, where you're just going to cleanse your database of a system. So all those things, when you're setting up your system, all those things need to be considered and planned for.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. No. It also kind of reaffirms the need to look at the drone incursion problem from a purpose built. When you're looking at the solutions and the technologies, focus on the problem itself, and shouldn't be coming at it from the background or perspective of surveillance or anything else, but really just focusing on the mission at hand in terms of detection and mitigation. And Michael, if you could,
if I could just add to that, I would say that the vast majority of incidents around of drones being where they shouldn't be are inadvertent. The FAA has a concept of the careless and the clueless. people that perhaps are not paying attention to where they should be or where they are and what might be around there, or the clueless. They might not even be aware that there is some piece of critical infrastructure there. And for those, education is really important. That you need to really be focusing on educating people about the existence of critical infrastructure like an airport and what are the rules of the air. The FAA has really put out a lot in terms of information to educate drone users. Part of getting your drone registered and part of getting a commercial authorization to fly a drone is premised upon your having an understanding of what the rules are in the airspace. And so education plays a key role. But as you've talked about, for that sort of an incursion, there's really no reason for you to collect a lot of highly detailed information that might be subject to privacy regulation. But as Mark pointed out, the third category that the FAA likes to talk about, the criminal, the people that are intent upon perhaps causing disruption or doing harm, you do want to have a purpose-built solution where you can identify, are you seeing the same pattern, the same drone appearing on different days at different times? And are you picking up some patterns there that might indicate that there is something that you need to be concerned about? And so, two basic points. Just let's recognize that the majority of people are not out to cause disruption. And education becomes really important, and your solutions need to be very focused around how do you prevent the inadvertent incident from happening. And then for that much smaller universe of cases where you do have reason to be concerned, you have to have the flexibility and the tools at your disposal to deal with it.
Makes sense. As we're heading towards the end here, I'd like to kind of now shift and get very pragmatic and very practical. So, when you talk about now and the future, and I know speaking to a lot of airport security and operations professionals, there is actually a lot of engagement. There's a lot of eagerness to do the right thing and to get started and to really take the first steps, knowing that it's a very dynamic environment and that there are things that they can do now and there are things that they'll maybe be able to do later, depending, of course, on what level they are and where they are and what authorities they have and so forth. But there sometimes, there seems to be a thirst for more knowledge or a kind of a roadmap or a prescription. They really want some prescriptive guidance on what they can do, A, to prepare, and B, to influence. So what can they do from their view as a professional in the aviation community? What can they start to implement, and what can they start to prepare to transition for the future as the regulatory environment and the technology environment changes? And also, how can they actually participate and engage and influence that environment? And so I know, Michael, we've spoken about that, and you have some opinions in that regard.
Well, I think the most important thing is to get engaged and to stay engaged in understanding what's going on here. I think that because this is evolving quickly and because airports occupy a really unique place where they ultimately will bear the responsibility and the impact of any disruption that takes place, it will serve them well to have an understanding of what's going on in their particular airport environment and to look at systems that enable them to have a view of what might be happening in and around the airport and helping to frame and develop a much better understanding of what their longer term actions need to be. The second thing is to share best practices. Both of the airport trade associations here in the US and Canada are very active in this whole area. working with legal authorities such as Mark and others in really helping to understand what that landscape looks like and how it's evolving. The third thing is recognize that this is an evolving policy landscape and regulatory landscape, and don't assume that because a particular regulation or a particular policy is a certain way today, that it's going to be that way forever. And don't wait for something to change. The airports are the ones that are dealing with this, and they're in a very unique position to provide input and advice through their trade associations or directly through their elected leaders of what are the tools that they would like to see, and what are the things that they would like to see at the federal level with their partners there to help them work collectively to deal with this ever-evolving threat. It's not going to go away, and so engagement is extremely important.
And in terms of what about in terms of gathering data regarding incidents in their environment, or just gathering data in terms of detection and being able to invest so that, as like you say, that environment and capabilities change and evolve, regulatory and technological, they'll be better equipped or better prepared. Is there is there a good rule of thumb there?
I think really detection is something, there's clearly no regulatory or legal impediment to doing detection today. I mean, people could be doing it now, even active detection involving radar. That's just a question of, getting the right approvals and making sure your systems are compatible. And in addition to the data aspect of it, I think the other thing to keep in mind, it's that old joke, when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. And it's funny because it's true. And one of the most important things is if you have a detection system that's not just relying on somebody, oh, I see a drone, the faster you can detect a threat, the faster you can get local law enforcement involved, and the faster you can take whatever steps are necessary to mobilize the resources either within the fence or outside the fence to try and either determine that, oh, it's not really a threat, it's just somebody, one of the clueless, or, oh no, this is somebody who we really need to be on top of, and we need to get the police to find out who this guy is and where his car is and where he's parked, and hopefully make an arrest or start gathering data. So detection really, it's key, not just for the future and determining how big is my threat now and how is it evolving, but God forbid if there's an incident tomorrow, detection is going to be a key point in making sure that the effect of the incursion is mitigated as much as possible.
And again, the unique airport environment will give each technology its own advantages and disadvantages. We have some of the issues we mentioned earlier, false positives, not always a good line of sight, noise issues and things like that. So I think what we're finding too, and what we're advising for best practices, is gather data not only on the frequency and the numbers and things like that, but also what are these objects? What type of drone is it? What manufacturer, what protocol? Are there patterns emerging? What are the capabilities of these drones, that to potentially cause future damage intentionally or otherwise or unintentionally? And so that's kind of part of the helpful data gathering process as well. With that, I know we're heading towards the top of the hour. Any final words, Michael, Mark, Michael?
No, I would just reinforce the last point that was made by Mark, and that is that if you don't understand a problem, it's very hard to mitigate it. And so you really want to take active steps to understand what's going on in your airport environment and use that to inform decisions that you're going to be making in the months and years ahead. Great. Mark?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think really now is the time for airports to be kind of laying the groundwork and determining what's the threat environment at my airport, and what do I need to do both to ensure that I can detect these things going forward, and do I need some kind of mitigation that's goes beyond just getting the local law enforcement involved, and do I need a systems-based approach, and then trying to make sure that you're working through with the regulators that those approaches are going to be available to you.
Excellent. Great. Well, this has been fascinating insights from both of you, Michael and Mark. We really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge and best practices with us. That's certainly, as you heard from Zohar at the beginning of the hour, we're very devoted to becoming an industry resource and providing this kind of thought leadership and best practices to the airport security and airport operational and aviation community going forward. Again, this is just the first in a series of webinars related to UAS and drone threats and countermeasures in the airport environment. So please stay tuned for the next ones. And you can also feel free to contact us at D-Fend Solutions through our website or in reply to any of the invitation emails, with any further questions that you might have. Thank you all. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one as well. And with that, we're signing off. Thank you very much. Until the
Thank you.
next airport webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.